Welcome, friends. Welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning and the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this cookbook. This is the Home Cookbook, published in Canada. I want to talk about the book. I find it to be a very interesting book. It is kind of a pivot point in cookbooks in Canada. But let's get started with the recipe because it takes a while to boil the beans. We're going to make something called Canadian baked beans, and the recipe does not, even though it's called baked beans, does not tell you how many beans to use. Just says boil the beans. Now, this is the bean pot that I'm going to use. Just Julie and I eating these beans. I don't need baked beans for a month, just the next couple of nights maybe. So what I've done is I take my bean pot and I put about a third of the pot in dry beans, knowing that as they boil, they're going to expand and they're going to get bigger, and then they will fill the pot for the next step. Okay, beans into the pot. Water into the pot. That's more than enough water. And I'm supposed to put in some salt pork. In goes the salt pork, lid goes on, and we'll bring that to a boil. Okay, so that's going to take a while to boil. We're supposed to boil them until the beans split. Now the book. So this book is originally published in 1877 here in Toronto. It is fully called The Home Cookbook, compiled by ladies of Toronto and chief cities and towns in Canada. Now this is the 70th edition. So I know that this cookbook was first published in 1877. If this is the 70th edition, this book itself could have been printed as late as 1905 or 1906, I think is when the last edition was printed. So it's somewhere in that later part of the printing. This is a cookbook that goes on to be published in Australia, New Zealand, and England. A very early cookbook that has such wide distribution is rare. It is considered by most the first real community cookbook in Canada. And what I mean by that is all of the recipes have the name of the person who submitted them, making it a community cookbook. It is a significant turning point in Canadian cookbooks because it is the first, among the first, not the first, but among the first cookbooks in Canada that aren't reprints of American or English cookbooks. There are so many early Canadian cookbooks that are just bald reproductions of cookbooks from other places. Change the title page, say you print it in Toronto or Montreal, and push it out there, but the recipes and everything else inside are from other places. This reflects the Canadian experience in Canada, using Canadian ingredients, using things that are familiar to Canadian housewives in this time period. So an incredibly pivotal book in English Canada cooking. Meanwhile, in Quebec, in Quebecois, in French cooking, the same things are happening. Completely different titles, completely different language. And there are several recipes in this book that go on to be classics, that are true Canadian recipes that were conceived here, that use ingredients from here, that go on and are still made today. There's a carrot pudding in here that I know from my childhood that gets its origin point in print anyway in this cookbook. A very significant cookbook. I'd love to get an original first edition with the preface that talks about the fundraising for the Sick Kids Hospital. I'm always on the lookout for that. If I can find one, I would love to. And it brings me into the sort of the realm of what is the first Canadian cookbook, the first English language Canadian cookbook, and the first French language Quebecois cookbook. I know what they are. I just need to find them. Now, the lid on my bean pot, not very tight. You do want to trap as much moisture inside the pot as possible when it's in the oven cooking for a couple hours. And you could, over the cooking time, come back to it again and again and add more liquid. But if you can stop steam from escaping, you've won the battle before it even starts. So I've got a piece of parchment paper, more than enough, more than adequate to cover the top of the bean pot. So what we're going to do is take our piece of parchment paper. We're going to fold it in half. We're then going to take the folded edge and fold it in half again. Now we've got two folded edges and two open edges. We're going to take this folded edge and we're going to fold it over into a triangle against that folded edge. And then we're just going to fold it again into another triangle. Now we've got a cone shape. That's as far as you need to fold it, but you can fold it one more time if you want to. Get an even tighter cone. Bring in our bean pot. Hold the tip generally where the center is, and then find a mark out here where the edge of the pot is. Take a pair of scissors. Cut it. Unfold it. And we now have a nice lid that will just sit on top of the beans and keep the steam in. Now, the beans are done. I'm just going to scoop them out with a slotted spoon into my bean dish. You want to have, it says, you want to make sure that they're sufficiently wet when they go into the bean pot. So I don't want to drain them. I want to hang on to some of that bean water. It looks really good. And we might need to put a little bit in when we add in the molasses. I might actually take the salt pork out for a moment. It says that I need to nestle the salt pork down into the beans. I'm going to mix in the molasses first. And it says 2 tablespoons. This is where recipes like this are very kind of funny to me. They specify how much salt pork to use and how much molasses to use, but give no indication of how many beans to use. And I would think that the amount of beans would inform the amount of the other ingredients that you would use, since most of the flavoring is going to come from those 2 other ingredients. The beans themselves not really bringing massive amounts of flavor. Anyway, 2 tablespoons of molasses. And I'm going to say that is 2 tablespoons. A little bit more, I know, but it'll be okay. So I'm going to stir that in. Doesn't tell me to stir it in, but I think maybe giving it a little bit of a stir might be a good idea. I might add a little bit more liquid in there just to make sure that they are moistened enough. And we'll get that salt pork in there. Nestle it in there nicely. Now, an interesting admonition in the recipe is down here. Do not forget the sweetening if you want Yankee baked beans. And I don't know if that means if you want Canadian baked beans, you don't add the molasses, or you add less molasses, or you add more molasses if you want Yankee baked beans. And before our viewers in the American US South get that smirk on their face, in this time period in Canada, anybody who lived south of the border was a Yankee. Didn't matter if you were from the south or the north, you were a Yankee. So I've got my parchment paper, and so I'll put that on top, lid on, maybe wipe off some of this, and into the oven. Couple hours at 325, and I'll check it a couple of times just to make sure it's not too dry. Okay, peel back the paper, and here we go. Okay, now I did add a little bit of liquid as it was cooking, and I chopped up the salt pork.
Hey, friends.
About halfway through and mixed it in. Even
Hey,
though
Glen.
That's not, hey, Jules.
Sorry, I'm totally interrupting you.
Even though that's not in the instructions. And I did have to add just a touch more liquid. Okay. Canadian baked beans.
Canadian baked beans.
Not
Okay.
not to be confused with those.
Does that mean there's maple syrup?
No.
Oh, see, that's an assumption I would have made.
Well, and that is a very good point. But no,
Looks very hot.
it is molasses or sugar. It just says molasses or sugar, but not too much because you don't want to turn them into Yankee baked beans.
Fair enough.
Huh. Okay. So this kind of follows a pattern almost from the dawn of the two countries sort of veering away from each other. In the United States, things became sweeter and sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And in Canada, they didn't become as sweet. They are now, fully now, as sweet.
Those are really good.
But when you look at the recipes from the 1800s, early 1900s, maybe right up until World War II, Canadian recipes are often much less sugar and much less salt.
I like this. I like this. It tastes like beans.
Yeah, beans with pork. This is really good. But of course, add a little more sugar. Could use a diced onion. You know, a diced onion would certainly sort of round out the flavor a little bit.
But it's working out.
Yeah.
You
You don't have salt pork, bacon. Bacon works perfectly fine. And you saw that I didn't really use any measurements other than the pot that I was going to end up putting it in the oven, a third full of dry beans, cover it with lots of water, boil it, and then there you go.
Is the recipe just a bunch of ratios?
No. It just says boil the beans until they begin to crack.
Okay.
The bean's the most important part. There's no measurement.
However many you need. Whatever you got.
Yep.
Put 'em in.
Yep. So just go from that sort of ratio. The end pot that you're going to use is about a third full of dry beans if you want to do a full pot. And then just boil it with lots of water and you'll be fine.
There you go.
Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.